Hello and welcome to the Lukex podcast. I'm your host, Dan Maurice, and with me in the studio today are my good friends Louise Glenn.
Hello.
Dan Coe.
Hello.
And calling in from Sweden, Daniel Abrahamsson.
Hello.
In today's episode, we journey to Jerusalem and Bethlehem to meet Palestinian peacemakers who are pioneering a brave new future in the midst of conflict, a future of non-violence, of reconciliation, and of deep countercultural love. Who are these people? What is their story? And what can they teach this generation in this moment? Let's find out. So Louise, you met me first in Jerusalem. Just to set the scene, I had walked, about 300 miles by this point. I was aiming for Nazareth on a 500-mile walk, but I stopped in Jerusalem just over halfway to meet some peacemakers, and you flew out to join me.
I did. I flew out to meet you after the last journey. I thought I was ready to be on a Dan Maurice adventure again, and I met you about halfway. You did call me a few times thinking you might not quite make it in time, but you were there faithfully welcoming me with a barbecue in our hostel, so it was great.
Yeah, it was actually a bit of a race across the desert to get to Jerusalem, but thank God I made it. And yeah, I met you in Jerusalem, in what felt like civilization after the desert, seeing a friend from home in a city with a glass of wine and a barbecue felt like heaven.
It was a good welcome for me as well. You were there faithfully waiting for me.
I was. And you started this whole adventure with me. So you were with me with Ross in the Atacama Desert in Chile.
Yeah, Jerusalem was a little bit different from the Atacama, I must say, a bit more bustly and full of life.
Yeah, that's true. And what a city, Jerusalem. And in fact, Danko, you're a history teacher.
Yeah.
So surely Jerusalem is quite an exciting place. Of all the cities in the world, Jerusalem's got to be a pretty exciting place for a history teacher.
Yeah, absolutely loved it. And purely from a historical, educational perspective, being there was amazing. Learned so much. And it was fantastic. Loved it.
Oh, yeah. And then our final member of the group touched down. In fact, I think my resounding memory in the Austrian hospice in a little underground dormitory, I woke up to see a grinning Swedish face about 6 inches away saying, "I've landed."
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah, I arrived in the night, I think, and I think you almost fell asleep. I'm not sure if you actually was asleep, but I was happy to see a familiar face.
Yeah, I actually stayed awake because I was going to come and meet you in the middle of the old city. In the dawn, but then I fell asleep clearly, or was dozing, and your face was just so like, I appear to have forgotten to go and meet Daniel, but he found himself here. So yeah, very good. And I feel actually our crew is quite, with Louise's Northern Irish lilt, and Danko's quite impressive ginger beard, and you're probably the most Scandinavian person I know, Sweden. So I actually feel like the odd one out in this group of semi-Vikings. We definitely didn't fit in Jerusalem, did we? So.
No, I think in your book you likened us to being an indie folk group, and we do look a bit like that.
Yeah. Fortunately, we weren't there to be tourists, and it's okay that we stuck out. In fact, I wanted to introduce you to some friends of mine, Palestinian peacemakers, and so we had a day kind of acclimatizing ourselves with Jerusalem, checking out the hummus.
Pomegranate juice from that wee man.
That was wonderful. I can recommend the guy in the Arrow Quarter of the old city who sells pomegranate juice squeezed freshly with root ginger. That was special.
Wow.
I mean, there's probably a guy in every corner who does that. So I can recommend all of them. We took a journey across the border into the West Bank to visit a friend of mine in Bethlehem. Wandered up through some steep cobbled streets to a rooftop cafe. It felt like a scene from Aladdin, climbing over roofs and up narrow sort of stairways, and then reached this sort of, literally nestled in the roof of this sort of complex was this tiny cafe. The air was thick with a smell of shisha, minty and lemon, and it kind of looked out across the Jordan desert actually. And we sat down with Sami Awad. Had a strong coffee. How much do you remember of his story? Because we had just made this journey from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, but his grandmother had also made a journey from Jerusalem to Bethlehem in 1948. Do you know why?
It's a bit patchy, the exact details, but something about his grandfather. Maybe was his grandfather killed in the uprising around that time.
Yeah, that's right.
It was part of the Nakba.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So good. That's a good detail because the Israelis would call it the Year of Independence, the beginning of their state, 1948, and the Palestinians call the same event the Nakba, which means
catastrophe.
That's right. Yeah, the catastrophe. Sammy always says everyone in the land starts their story with in 1948, but obviously goes in very different directions depending on how 1948 panned out for them. And for Sammy's grandmother, they lived in Jerusalem, the whole family. And in fact, let me play you the part of a clip where he shares with us that beginning of his story.
In the past, when I used to share my story, I would jokingly say that I start with an opening line that is the opening line for Palestinians and Israelis when they share their stories, that we actually have something in common, which is the opening line. In 1948. But then, of course, we take completely different directions. More recently, I started realizing that when I share my story by saying in 1948, it feeds into a bigger narrative of this land, a bigger story about this land, which you probably have heard before, that this land has always been conflict, always been war. These people have been fighting each other for hundreds of years, thousands of years. Some people even theologically claim that what our conflict today is a continuous of a conflict that started maybe 3,000-4,000 years ago with Abraham's kids. Ishmael and Isaac had their rift together, and some genetic mutation happened, and every day we wake up just wanting to kill each other. All of these years. Most people actually forget that the brothers actually reconciled when they buried their father. And so that actually conflict ended. And so more recently, I shifted my opening line. And my opening line now is before 1948. What was life like in this land before that war happened? And specifically, I refer to the neighborhood that my father was born in and grew up in, which is Jerusalem. A neighborhood that was actually evenly divided between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, who actually lived very well with each other. They did things together. The families did events together, celebrations together. The children played together. The women cooked together. They knew each other in a very, very deep way. This neighborhood, like many neighborhoods and communities in this land, was one where the Christian families and the Muslim families would go and do service to the Jewish families during Shabbat. I don't know if you know, in Shabbat, you know what Jews do during that time. Exactly, all of you are right, nothing. There's no work, no labor. And then so these Christian families and Muslim families would do the tasks that these Jewish families could not do during Shabbat, including turning on and off the lights for them, turning on and off the ovens for them. And they would just go into their homes and, hi neighbor, and turn the lights on and go out. Imagine any of us doing that today to our neighbors. And so for me, and I'm not trying to present it as a utopian paradise that existed. There were conflicts, there were challenges. Most of these conflicts were actually imported from the outside into this land that created these rifts. But that sense of exclusivity to this land, that it's ours and only ours, the hatred that we live in now and the fear and violence that we live in now did not exist during that time. And so for me, one of the questions is what happened? What happened that changed that reality to this reality that we live in today? 1948 happened and the family suffered tremendously. My father's family suffered. My grandfather, or the father, was killed in the war. He was killed as a civilian. He wasn't involved in the combat. Shot by a sniper. And when the Jewish forces took over that neighborhood, they demanded that all the non-Jewish families leave their homes. And so we became part of the Palestinian refugee population, or the family. During that time, about 80% of the Palestinian population became refugees. So just imagine 80% of a whole nation or a whole country being evicted, removed, forced out, convinced to leave, for whatever reason, leave their homes and become refugees. Close to 500 towns and villages were destroyed by the Israeli army. And so we call it the Nakba, 1948, which means catastrophe. The reason I share that story is because I always say the reason why I do everything I do now is my grandmother. My grandmother, who lost her husband, lost her home, lost her property, lost her future, as she would say it, was a woman that always insisted through her faith that as a family we will never seek revenge and retaliation for what happened to us. But also as a family, through our faith, we will also never remain silent in the face of violence and injustice, that we will proactively seek peace and reconciliation with those who have done this to us. And so that was the seed that was planted, that for me, I say everything we do now comes from her words, her calling to her family.
How would you feel if you were Sami in his situation?
Yeah, I guess naturally would feel a sense of anger and bitterness towards people who committed the Nakba and who had murdered his grandfather. I guess that maybe many of us might say that's a kind of a natural kind of instinct in that situation. Maybe there might be a desire for revenge. I'm not sure. Yeah, I wonder whether I'd be prone to want to feel like that.
Yeah. And I guess that there's a human instinct that wants to avenge the death of a loved one.
Yeah.
But that wasn't Sami's attitude, or it wasn't his grandmother's attitude. And it felt like she set a tone. He said it's like a seed she sowed in the family.
You'd like to think you'd be that loving person, but it sounds very difficult.
Yeah.
I think for someone to understand your pain, I think you might want to make it real to them. So I think revenge might be something you might seek. I might seek. But just to say, do you really know what it's like? Do you know what you've done? But that's not his way, really, is it?
No. And interestingly, it wasn't victimhood either. So I think you can see people going two ways, or as many ways you can go. But one way is the sort of victimhood sob story, woe is me. Another is the angry revenge, sort of violent retribution. But he didn't really seem to identify with either, even though I'm sure both would have been tempting. He wasn't telling us that sob story to try and get us to sympathize with him or unite against Israel. That wasn't his narrative. He shared his story because that is the truth. That's what happened to his family. And every generation since, his father's generation and his generation, have suffered under occupation. But he didn't identify as a victim. And as the conversation continued, it became clear that he was choosing to act as, not victimhood or violence, but something altogether different.
Yeah, he wanted to really seek peace, didn't he? Not just it's done and justice has been served for this one incident. He really wanted to build peace within the two communities in a real person-to-person way.
Yeah.
Kind of take away isolated incidents and just build people who are against each other to be together.
Yeah.
Which is amazing.
Oh, extraordinary. Should we hear what he said?
Yeah.
Living in the Holy Land, living in the midst of conflict, what we believe can really bring an answer to peace and justice in this land is by engaging the communities in the peacemaking process. That it's not just about what the politicians decide, but it's also how does any peace that we come up with really honors and respects and brings dignity to the local communities in whatever identity they represent themselves. As an organization, we are not looking for political solutions to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We're looking for the human solutions. How can we get the communities in this land to truly recognize and acknowledge the full equal right of the other to be in this land? And knowing that there is an occupation, there is an oppression, we cannot ignore those facts as well. So the three main pillars of our work, the first one is nonviolence. We fully believe that there is a nonviolent solution to this conflict. Violence is not the answer. In the midst of all the violence that we experience and see as Palestinians, we are an organization that fully promotes nonviolent resistance and activism to the occupation, to end the oppression that we as Palestinians face. And we work with many Israelis in this regard. The second pillar of our work is healing, because we fully believe that many of us are motivated by the traumas that we have experienced in the past, and the traumas that we have experienced not necessarily just between us as Palestinians and Israelis, but traumas that we have inherited from other experiences have shaped our identity and how we view others. Looking into the Holocaust, for example, is very important to our work. How can we, as Palestinians, even be supporting our Jewish brothers and sisters from freeing themselves from the trauma and the pain of what the Holocaust created for them? And of course, the history of anti-Jewish behavior that existed in Europe, that was imported, that fear was imported into this land. And it continues to motivate many Jews in how they relate to us as Palestinians. And for us as Palestinians, the Nakba, the catastrophe in 1948, and the trauma that created for us as Palestinians, how can we bring healing and liberation from that so that we can really be able to move on to build a future for our own community and our own identity, independent from that. And the third component is transformation, which is a leadership training program that we do that really creates a space for leaders to begin to become aware, not just what motivates them, but how they're motivated in the decisions that they make, and how can they make those strong decisions for peace and justice and equality in this land that are not motivated by our past experiences, but are motivated by a real vision of peace and equality and justice. And so transformation, nonviolence, and healing are the three pillars of our engagement.
How do you feel about that? Sweden, what gripped you in Sami's story?
I think, as you said earlier, that it's not an angry way he speaks, or not even a sad way he speaks. He just kind of speaks the truth that his family have lived and that he's living, and that the people in Palestine and also Israel is living right now. But it's interesting because these are never the stories you hear. You only hear either side of the conflict, depending on what side of the politics you are. You either think that Israel is inherently the enemy and inherently evil, or that Palestinians are evil and are just the enemy. And the longer we stayed, and every day when we met new people, we realized that it's not that simple. We find that there are people wanting to have peace, basically.
Yeah. And quite extraordinary, the story he shared of life in Jerusalem pre-1948, when Jews, Christians and Muslims lived together, to an extent where the Christians and Muslims would go into the homes of the Jews during Shabbat to just turn the lights on and off to really honor their religious practice. I mean, it's a wonderful.
I loved I think you mentioned this in the book, Dan. Sami talks about how he went to Auschwitz to kind of see the Holocaust in a new light, kind of witnessing where some of it happened. And he said that for him, I guess, as a Palestinian, understanding more about Jewish history, about Israeli history, understanding when they talk about 1948, they're talking about, I guess the Holocaust was before that, and then independence. And actually that is so important in that reconciliation between these two enemies, that are understanding the other, right? Because rather than having a fear of the other, which leads to hostility and which leads to conflict and which leads to violence, so important you have almost an education and an understanding, then that breaks down fear. Yeah. And you realize, these guys are all right, or they're like me, and we both eat hummus,
Yeah.
And that's the way that's one of the key ways that reconciliation happens. So I thought that was really interesting, like understanding their history.
Yeah.
Good shout out to my profession, really, teaching history. So
100%.
History's so important, isn't it?
But to understand the history of a narrative of the other person. So obviously everyone tells history through their own eyes, with their own victim and oppressor narratives nicely set up. But to step into someone else's shoes and say, well, how do you see this situation when the roles are reversed? And to just, like, what I loved about the way Sami kind of interacted with his Jewish friends was he didn't just come along with a rant. He was very happy to share his story and say, this is how we see it. But he would also then step into their shoes and say, okay, how can I really try and put myself in your shoes, really understand the trauma you've been through, really empathize, really love, really try and serve you in that, help you overcome your trauma. And it just takes so much courage to do that. It's very hard to let go of your own narrative, but it's such a mature and such a compassionate response. I actually realised my own grandfather, Bernard Sam Gwyther, was in Jerusalem at the same time as Sammy's grandfather, which felt quite a personal realisation. So pre-1948, the area was British Palestine. He was there as a part of the British Palestinian police force as a mounted policeman, keeping the peace. That was his job. That's what my gran said that he did. And I often wondered how he felt about what happened in his wake. I mean, the British certainly didn't manage to keep the peace. I even wonder whether he ever saw Sammy's grandfather going into the home of one of his Jewish neighbours to turn the lights on and off and put the oven on during Shabbat.
That'd be amazing.
Mm.
Yeah. Could have passed in the street.
Damascus Gate.
Yeah. That was our entry point to Gold City. Many a shawarma we ate at the Damascus Gate.
Oh, we did.
Tell me back. Tell me back.
Make hummus, not war.
Yeah.
That's it. I've got a postcard of that in my room. I want to get that on a t-shirt.
That was written on the... do you remember where we saw that?
On the West Bank wall?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I love that.
Bit like a Northern Irish wall, I'd say.
Yeah, quite. Well, yeah. I mean, your personal history, do you see any parallels between Israel-Palestine and what you experienced growing up in Northern Ireland?
There is a kind of affinity, I think, in Northern Ireland in some people groups with the Israeli or the Palestinian side.
Yeah.
But I think in any conflict, you are on one side, or whether you're there actively or there by your environment, there's your side and then there's us and them.
Yeah.
And I do think it's the same in Northern Ireland. You might grow up in your area and the other is on the other side of the fence, or the other side of the peace wall, or the other side of the Jordan, or us and them. So I think it's a similar conflict in many ways because it's people disagreeing, and it's different in many ways, but actually the us and them mentality of any conflict is something that I think Sammy's trying to get out of.
Yeah.
I think Sammy's trying to help people see the them as people.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's very active. And so what I love about Sammy's approach was he wasn't just sitting around in his community thinking about this. He went and engaged with people from, like, to go to Auschwitz is, I imagine he would have had Palestinian friends saying, what are you doing? It's a very brave way to really try and engage in their story. And often I think people think that peacemaking is quite passive, but actually to be a true peacemaker is very, it's not passivity. It actually takes an enormous amount of strength and courage to step into the shoes of your enemy. And he would walk to different communities. I remember the first time I met him, he'd just come back from meeting a Jewish settler, ultra-Orthodox, who was very honest about the fact that he wanted to get rid of the Palestinian people. And Sammy sat down and said, okay, well, let's have a conversation about this. Let me introduce you to one of those Palestinian people. And he will chat with friends, he'll chat with enemies, he'll chat with people on every side, every persuasion, but always to listen and to learn and to love first, which, and again, just must have a strength to not just jump and quickly, here's my narrative. Yeah, amazing. And interestingly, he talked about the motivation for that peacemaking approach being his faith. I think a lot of people consider religion to be part of a problem, but for Sammy, yeah, his faith was the fuel behind his desire to seek peace. We asked him about that, didn't we?
Yeah, he said, blessed are the peacemakers. But he also warned that straight after that, people who make peace might also be persecuted, even from their own.
Yeah.
It might be unpopular to make peace. People might be quite happy in their bitterness or happy to have an enemy.
Yeah.
But actually making peace can be tricky.
Indeed. Let's see what he said.
For me, I'm actually proud to say that everything I do, I look at as being motivated by Jesus and his teachings. And I really believe more than ever that the teachings of Jesus are exactly what we need to truly bring peace and justice and equality and reconciliation in this land. The two verses that really stick out to me when it comes to following teaching of Jesus, and the first one is loving the enemy. And for me, it's been a really deep journey to understand what does it mean for me as a Palestinian living under occupation, living under oppression, to be called by the person that I want to follow and to commit my life to, that when it comes to my enemy, I am not just to make peace with them or reconcile with them or reach an agreement with them, but to love them. And the two things that have really stuck out for me in response to this is the first one is that the moment you love somebody, you break fear. There is no fear in love. And so the first act of loving is for me to break my fear of my enemy and to be able to stand in front of my enemy as an equal to them, not to resist them, not to fight them, not to show I am more powerful than them, but to truly say, I am equal to you and I come to you in love. The second component of loving is to understand who you are to love. How can you love somebody without knowing who they are, what motivates them, what makes them decide what they decide? And that has been a very powerful journey for me to begin to understand what makes my enemy, what motivates them. And to see that in my enemy, with the amazing strength and power that they have, that in the core of it, it is fear that is motivating them. And so this is where the second verse comes in for me, which answers the question, how did Jesus handle this? How did Jesus deal with the reality that he lived in? And Matthew 4:23 is the verse that really sticks out to me, where it says that Jesus walked through the Galilee. He was teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing their illnesses. And so the four things of peacemaking that we engage in is walking, which means we go to where our enemy is. We don't sit in our ivory castles and hotels and five-star luxury apartments. You have to go to where the people are. And that's what Jesus did. He walked, he met with the Samaritans, he went to where they were. And what he did there was he was healing. He didn't go there to judge, he didn't go there to condemn. He understood that people need to be healed. And for me, when I look in the teaching of healing, in the past I used to look to Jesus when he was healing like a Superman figure. You know, he's got this amazing ability to make miracles and heal people. But then I began to understand, and more now, this is why we do a lot of healing work, is because to understand that when Jesus was healing, he wasn't just trying to show himself off. Jesus was liberating people from the constraints that did not allow them to live their humanity the way God intended that humanity to be lived. If it's physical, emotional, or spiritual wounds, we all need to be healed so that we can be free to begin to see what we are responsible for ourselves, for our communities, and for people around us. And then he was teaching them. Once you are healed from the pain, you need to learn how to live your life. And for me, the Sermon on the Mount is full of examples of teachings. And that's what he was teaching us, how to live our life today. And to understand that at the end of the day, Jesus was a peacemaker. He came to teach us how to make peace with God and how to make peace with our fellow human beings in this world. And I think for me to deeply also understand that being a peacemaker also calls for us to be able to ready to sacrifice ourselves, to even be persecuted for the peacemaking that we do. Because it's interesting, when in the Sermon on the Mount, the verse that comes after blessed are the peacemakers is blessed are the persecuted. And it doesn't say who will persecute you. So you should expect persecution even from your own people, from being in that space of being a peacemaker where you're standing for truth and justice and healing of the wounds of the communities, not just representing your people towards the other people.
Wow. That's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, it's good to hear it again. I remember on the whole trip, especially Sammy's story included, I remember it kind of, for me, kind of unlocked something of faith that I've not seen, not really understood before. That, you know, I've read the Sermon on the Mount before, and I've read love your enemies when Jesus says that. And I always thought that's like, I can see that as radical, I can see that's countercultural, but I don't, almost like, who are my enemies? I don't know, like, is it some kids at school, or is it like somebody who cuts me up on the motorway? To me, I never almost felt the gravity of some of his teachings. And then going to the Holy Land and chatting to Sammy and chatting to other people, being like, wow, this kind of unlocks something of the teachings of Christ in a way that I've never understood before.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're lucky we don't have many enemies.
Yeah.
And we don't live that because we don't have to. But actually to see someone living it in a real way, in a really practical way, is amazing.
Yeah. And I think even though we don't have enemies on the scale that Sammy would, I still think there's something that we can learn here in the West, because in our nice, comfortable lives, people do get very, very upset. Often with people quite similar to themselves, but someone who is in a different team or voted for a different party or voted for a different decision even, or holds a slightly different view on a different political issue. There's so much anger. And maybe that's exaggerated on social media or exaggerated in different circles where you're surrounded by people of the same opinion. But I think the same principles stand, that Sammy's desire was to understand where the other person is coming from, not even to agree. Like, he was very open about the fact that he still resists the oppression. He doesn't want the houses of his neighbours being bulldozed, and he will go and rebuild those houses. But at the same time, he's still trying to understand the people who are doing that act to help liberate them from the trauma which led them to live in constant fear. So it's both. It's supporting his story and his people, and also trying to understand the narrative of the other at the same time, and to try and see the humanity in both.
Definitely. And know your enemy, and then love your enemy. You can love someone if you know something about them that you don't like, and then actively choose to love.
Yeah.
Really get what gets them going.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that thing as well of like Moog going to, like that thing he said about Jesus, like Jesus went. That thing of being
100%.
proactive, of like going to the problem, and rather than just tweeting about it or pontificating, whatever, it's like actually going and being that change. But like Gandhi said that, didn't he? Being the change you want to see, and being the one that moves towards the problem or the enemy or the vulnerable or whatever. I think that's really inspiring, challenging.
And those face-to-face meetings are so important, because I think when someone is a supposed enemy, and you saw this particularly in Israel-Palestine, because they're so separated, for a lot of Israelis living in gated communities, the only Arabs they will know of are the ones they see on the TV.
Yeah.
And the horror stories they read in the papers. And likewise with a lot of Palestinians, the Israelis they know are soldiers. And so it's very easy just to see them as this kind of faceless enemy with guns or whatever. When you sat down and met someone and heard their story and looked into the white of their eyes and, seen them laugh at the same jokes or see them cry because they've lost someone, and you start to realize that you have the same emotions and the same desires for peace, and often the same things the other way around. So one of the really beautiful stories I read about was the Parent Circle. It's a little movement in Israel-Palestine of parents who have lost children in the conflict or family, but from both sides. So Palestinians will sit down with people, with Israelis. Maybe, I remember there was a story I read in a book I quoted in my book. It was Aziz Abu Sarah talked about his friend Nurit, and Nurit's daughter had been killed by a suicide bomber, and his brother had been killed by Israeli soldiers. And they both sat down and went, you know what? Neither of us like this. Let's both fight for a future where, we don't lose more children.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's crazy, actually. Sometimes the people who are most involved are the ones most motivated for peace. And it can be the people on the periphery who are most angry. And I feel like as the internet, in the international community, one of the best things we can do is to listen to both sides and love both, love people from every camp, rather than quickly wading in and just throwing our opinion out there.
Yeah.
Because if Sami can do that, living in the conflict, knowing what it's like to get beaten up, how much more should we be doing that?
And realise the humanity in everyone.
Yeah.
It makes me think of a guy we met at the Tent of Nations who said to his children, don't be scared when they're faced with the soldiers. They're just people. And once you see the humanity in the soldier or the humanity in the enemy, suddenly thinking they're just people who might want to play football or eat.
Everyone wants to play
chicken.
football. And everyone wants to eat chicken.
Suddenly they're less scary.
Yeah. What's that book, Jerusalem, that I think you bought me? It was written by a Jewish and a Palestinian chef. And they talked about the conflict a little bit in the introduction and said, look, we both agree on food.
Yeah.
Can hummus end this war?
Yeah.
I'll have to find that
The
quote.
hope of hummus.
When you do a line again, make hummus, not war.
Mate, absolutely.
How about you, Swedan?
So many things from the trip that I still bring with me. I still think about so much today, but that the thing you have been saying and that Sammy has been saying is, to know your enemy or know the people that are different from you and want things that you don't want, and we all face that in different regards, with the different political views or people of different religions. But I think people in Sweden definitely, but I think that is true for Britain as well, and so many countries in the world, that we have so many opinions of other people that we don't know, and we look down on people that we don't know. But it's much harder to say a lot of these things as soon as we get to know someone. We still don't have to agree with everything, but we still can see it in a different perspective. And I think that is so true. And I've been living with people from Iran and from Afghanistan and from that have families from Eritrea, and you have preconceived ideas of how people are, how people from different countries are. It wasn't necessarily bad preconceived ideas, but you just realize there's so much you don't know if you don't ask, if you don't go and meet those people.
Yeah, absolutely. And getting people to meet one another is what Sami did so well. Because the thing is, and it's the definition of peace that I feel like I've grown to see in the heroes I've met on this journey, is that peace isn't the absence of conflict. That's good. It's a good starting point, but that's just separation. But ultimately, for true, deep, lasting peace, to take the definition of peace, that the Hebrew word shalom, or in Arabic salam, that's not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of something. It's a wholeness and a harmony within and between people. And you can't get that from separation. So if people are separated, they might not be fighting. They don't know and love one another. They still might be living in prejudice and fear. Whereas when people meet and learn to overcome their differences, learn to love and serve and forgive and sacrifice their own agenda, all those things, that's like a real active, that's the presence of true peace rather than the absence of a negative. And I feel like those little communities that he's building, with Jews and Palestinians working together and learning to love one another despite their shared histories, that's real peace. Thank you for listening to the Luke X podcast. If you want to dig deeper into these stories and others like them, you can find them in the book Finding the Peacemakers by me, Dan Maurice, published by Hodder & Stoughton, available from wherever you buy books. Thanks to Sami Awad from the Holy Land Trust for his words of wisdom, mined from a lifetime of pioneering peace in the Holy Land, and for welcoming 3 Brits and a Swedish musician into Bethlehem like we were family. If you want to find out more about the Holy Land Trust, or if you're thinking of visiting, then go to holylandtrust.org and we'll put the link in the show notes. If you're enjoying the Luke X podcast, please subscribe, leave us a review, and share your favourite episode on social media. We'd love to get these stories out there, and if you can help spread the word, we'd be eternally grateful. In the next episode, I'll be back in the studio with Louise, Danko, and Swedan as we reflect on part 2 of our Bethlehem adventure on a hilltop farm with a family who are trailblazing a way of life around a simple, beautiful principle. We refuse to be enemies. What does that look like on the ground in the 21st century at the epicenter of a conflict? We'll be finding out in the next episode.